Good day, everyone. My name is Charlene. We are now on Lesson 7, and we will be learning about cognitive perspective. For this lesson, we have 5 learning objectives. First is to explain the principles and laws of gestalt psychology. Second is to discuss about the information processing theory. Third is to identify Gagnes conditions of learning and principles in teaching. And fourth is to describe Ausubel's subsumption theory. And fifth is to elaborate Bruner's constructivist theory. The cognitive perspective focuses on how people are able to think, remember, store, and use information. It has become a major driving force in psychology because of its focus mainly on memory, intelligence, perception, thought process, problem solving, language, and learning. Gestalt is a German word meaning an organized whole or configuration. 3 Gestalt psychologists by the names of Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Kofka suggested that learners actively process and restructure data in order to understand it. They have arrived with the idea of perceptual process. According to them, the way people form perceptions are guided by the following principles or laws. First, we have the law of proximity. It states that humans perceive stimuli that are close to each other by grouping them and recognizing them as part of the same object. On the other hand, stimuli that stand far from one another are parts of 2 or more different objects. So for example, in this figure, the circle on the left appear to be grouped in vertical columns, while the circles on the right appear to be grouped in horizontal rows. Next, we have the law of similarity. This law holds that a learner can normally recognize stimuli that have physical resemblance at some degree as part of the same object. On the other hand, stimuli with different physical properties are part of a different object. So for example, in this figure, we seem to see circles forming a square and squares forming a cross within the square. Then we have the law of closure. The brain tends to perceive forms and figures in their complete appearance despite the absence of one or more of the missing parts, either hidden or totally absent. In this figure, we can see that the triangle is missing parts, which make it incomplete. Next, we have the law of good continuation. Learners have the tendency to continue contours whenever the elements of the pattern establish and imply direction. So for example, in this figure, point A and point C makes one curved line, and point B and point D makes another curved line that overlaps to point A and point C. Next, we have the law of good pragnance. The stimulus is organized into as good as a figure as possible. Based on our experiences with perception, we expect certain patterns and therefore perceive expected patterns. So for example, in this figure, we perceive it as a square overlapping a triangle and not a combination of several complicated shapes. Then we have the law of figure or ground. This is where learners tend to pay attention and perceive things in the ground first. A stimulus will be perceived as separate from the ground. For example, some learners will see this figure as a tree with birds flying away from it, and others will see a gorilla and lioness looking eye to eye. Next, we have the information processing theory, which is a cognitive theoretical framework which focuses on how knowledge enters and is stored in and how it is retrieved from our memory. This describes how the learner receives information from the environment through the senses, and what takes place in between determines whether the information will continue to pass through the sensory register, then to the short-term memory, and then to the long-term memory. Certain factors that would determine whether the information will be retrieved or remembered when the learners need it are as follows. The types of knowledge include general versus specific. These involves whether the knowledge is useful in many tasks or only in one. Then we have declarative, which refers to the actual knowledge. It relates to the nature of how things are. They may be in word or image form, for example, your name, age, or address. Then we have procedural. This knowledge refers on how to do things that require steps, example, making a syllabus or a lesson plan. Next is episodic, which is the knowledge that includes memories of life events such as your 18th birthday and graduation. Then we have conditional. This knowledge is about knowing when and why to apply declarative or procedural knowledge. The IPT asserts three stages in the progression of external information becoming incorporated into the internal cognitive structure of choice. These three stages are encoding, where information is sensed, perceived, and attended to; storage, which is where information is stored for either a short or long period of time; and retrieval. It is where information is brought back at the appropriate time and reactivated for use on a current task, the true measure of effective memory. Most theories of information processing revolve around the three main stages of memory processes. First, we have the sensory register, which holds all sensory information for a brief time. Under it are short-term memory or the working memory and the long-term memory. Now, the short-term memory can hold only 5 to 9 chunks of information, and it is called working memory since it is where all new information is temporarily placed while it is mentally being processed. The long-term memory is the final permanent storing house of memory information. It has unlimited capacity and indefinite duration. It holds the stored information until needed again. The executive control process are processes that guide the flow of information through the system, help the learner make informed decisions about how to categorize, organize, or interpret information. Then we have forgetting, which is the inability to retrieve or access information when needed. There are two ways in which forgetting takes place. First is decay. This is where information is not attended to or eventually fades away. This is prevalent in working memory. Then we have interference. It is where new or old information blocks access to the information in question. Let's move on to Robert Gagne's conditions of learning. His theory stipulates that there are different types or levels of learning. The importance of these classifications is that each different type of learning requires different types of instruction. Gagne was able to identify 5 categories of learning. First, we have the verbal information, which is stating the previously learned material such as facts, concepts, principles, and procedures. Example is listing all the presidents of the Republic of the Philippines. Then we have the intellectual skills. We have discrimination, which is distinguishing objects, features, or symbols; concrete concepts, which is identifying classes of concrete objects, features, or events. Defined concepts involves classifying new examples of ideas or events by their definition. And rules involves applying single relationship to solve a class of problems. And lastly, we have the higher order rules, which involves applying a new combination of rules to solve a complex problem. Cognitive strategies involves employing personal ways to guide learning, thinking, acting, and feeling. Example is constructing brain maps of topics being studied. Then we have attitudes, which is choosing personal actions based on internal states of understanding and feeling. Example is deciding whether or not to eat healthy instead of eating junk food. And lastly, we have motor skills, which is executing performances involving the use of muscles. Example is doing the steps of tinikling. Gagne suggested that learning tasks for intellectual skills can be organized in a hierarchy according to complexity. First, we have stimulus recognition, response generation, procedure following, use of terminology, discriminations, concept formation, rule application, and problem solving. The theory includes the 9 instructional events and corresponding cognitive processes. We have reception, expectancy, retrieval, selective perception, semantic encoding, responding, reinforcement, retrieval, and generalization. Let us move on to David Ausubel's meaningful verbal learning or subsumption theory. He suggested that knowledge is hierarchically organized, that new information is meaningful to the extent that it can be related to what is already known. He also believed that before new material can be presented effectively, the learner's cognitive structure should be strengthened by using advanced organizers. Meaningful learning takes place through 4 processes. First is by derivative subsumption. Learning takes place when a teacher adds new knowledge to an existing knowledge. Correlative subsumption is when new material is an extension or elaboration of what is already known. Superordinate subsumption is when specific knowledge is grouped into a general knowledge, while combinatorial subsumption is where a learner uses his prior knowledge to enrich the understanding of a newly acquired knowledge. Advanced organizers are a major instructional tool proposed by Ausubel. The 4 types of advanced organizers are as follows. First is expository, which describes new content. We have narrative, which presents the new information in the form of a story to students. Skimming, which is done by looking over new material to gain a basic overview. And graphic organizer. It is where visuals are set up or outline the new information. This organizer includes pictographs, descriptive patterns, concept patterns, and concept maps. Let's move on to Jerome Bruner's constructivist theory. His theory is that learning is an active process wherein learners construct new ideas or concepts based upon their current or past knowledge. He suggested the ability to represent knowledge in 3 stages. These stages are the following. We have enactive representation, where children represent objects in terms of their immediate sensation towards them. Then we have iconic representation. Learning can be obtained through using models and pictures, and it allows one to recognize objects when they are changed in minor ways. And lastly, we have symbolic representation. A learner has developed the ability to think in abstract terms and uses symbol system to encode knowledge. Bruner stated that a theory of instruction should address 4 major aspects. First is predisposition to learn, which is also known as readiness for learning. Second is structure of knowledge, which refers to the ways which a body of knowledge can be structured so that it can be most readily grasped by the learner. And third is effective sequencing. No one sequence will fit every learner, but in general, the lesson can be presented in an increasing difficult manner. Then we have reinforcement. Reward and punishment should be selected and paced appropriately based on the type of learner. So that would be all for today. Remember, an investment in knowledge always pays the best interest, according to Ben Franklin. Thank you all for listening. I'll see you in my next video. Have a nice day.